A relationship with the right referral partner could be a game changer for any B2B company. So what if you could reverse engineer these relationships at a moment's notice? Start a podcast, invite potential referral partners to be guests on your show, and grow your referral network faster than ever. Learn more at sweetfishmedia.com.
You're listening to B2B Growth, a daily podcast for B2B leaders. We've interviewed names you've probably heard before, like Gary Vaynerchuk and Simon Sinek, but you've probably never heard from the majority of our guests. That's because the bulk of our interviews aren't with professional speakers and authors. Most of our guests are in the trenches leading sales and marketing teams. They're implementing strategy. They're experimenting with tactics. They're building the fastest growing B2B companies in the world. My name is James Carberry. I'm the founder of Sweetfish Media, a podcast agency for B2B brands, and I'm also one of the co-hosts of this show. When we're not interviewing sales and marketing leaders, you'll hear stories from behind the scenes of our own business. We'll share the ups and downs of our journey as we attempt to take over the world. Just kidding. Well, maybe. Let's get into the show.
Welcome back to B2B Growth. I am your host, Nikki Ivy of Sweetfish Media. And today I've got with me James Allgrove, who is head of startup business development at Stripe. James, how you doing today?
I'm good. Thanks for having me, Nikki.
I'm super excited to talk about what we've got slated here. And so you're going to talk about how developers are different and the way that Stripe has sort of focused on developers as an entry point versus the traditional procurement team way of selling into an organization. And we've got a lot to dig into as far as, you know, how they're different as a group and little ways to keep that in mind to move things forward. But first, I'd like for you to just tell us a little bit more about you and your background and what you guys are up to over there at Stripe these days.
Yeah, for sure. So, I'm James. I'm based in New York at the moment, and I lead Stripe's business development strategy for startups and early stage tech companies. I've been with Stripe for about 5 years. I originally started actually in London, which is where I'm from, as you might be able to tell from my accent. And so I started in London and originally set up the UK business and kind of spent 3.5 years scaling that out, and then moved to New York to set up the office here and to lead our startup BD efforts. So for those listeners who don't know about Stripe or don't know much about Stripe yet, we build tools and infrastructure that help internet companies take payments and move and manage their money online. We're live in about 32 different markets worldwide, and we're growing all the time. And we work with a whole range of different companies, very small ones to very large ones. You know, a lot of earlier stage companies like Glossier, Tableau, Linebike, and then all the way through to much bigger ones, Slack, Shopify, Amazon, for example. And it's really a toolkit that can power lots of different business models. For example, we let our users not just take payments in, but also manage how they pay out to sellers if they're a marketplace or a platform. They can issue credit cards. They can, use tools that we have for analytics and fraud management. And so over the course of the time I've been at Stripe, obviously the company's grown a lot and the sales strategy's definitely evolved. But I think one thing that hasn't really changed that much is our focus on developers and selling to them. So I'm excited to be here and chatting with you about that today.
Yeah. So what you guys have done that I found just super exciting is you're laying this infrastructure, this invisible foundation for, like you talked about, how payment is addressed online between companies that is really underserved. And the fact that you guys are focusing on developers as the way in is a big deal. So talk a little bit first about why Stripe decided to focus the entire brand on software developers.
Yeah, it's a good question. So I guess to understand that, we got to rewind a little bit and go back in time to when Stripe just started. And John and Patrick, who are the founders of the company, they're developers by trade, and they'd started a couple of companies before. And they always found when it came to integrating payments into whatever they were building was like the most difficult, most painful, most unpleasant part of kind of setting that company up. And so that's really how the kind of idea for Stripe came along. And they'd really experienced that that pain firsthand. And so they wanted to build a product which is really developer-centric and kind of makes it really easy for developers to integrate payments into whatever they're working on. And so the kind of strategy of selling developers came out of the fact that the product was so developer-centric. And so that's worked very well for us in the fact that, developers are increasingly calling the shots on what infrastructure to use, what payment providers to use. And I think that's a function of both kind of startups kind of emerging over the last 5-10 years who are much more technically enabled, and then also larger companies having to have more of a focus on technology and building more themselves. And so I think that means that change has meant that where payments was traditionally owned by maybe the procurement team, as you mentioned, or like the finance team, it's now developers that are making a lot of those decisions. And that's one thing that surprised me, is that's true even in larger companies. I often get kind of CFOs of pretty big companies calling me up being like, all my developers want to use Stripe for this project, but I don't really, that's not who we're using at the moment. I need to learn more about it to be able to sign it off. And so I think it's been interesting seeing that change in the dynamic whereby there's a lot more, technically led decision making going on.
For sure.
And I think
sure.
you mentioned that's kind of part of it being underserved, and I think that's definitely true, right? Like today, less than 5% of global consumer spending happens online. And I think a lot of that comes down to the fact that like the right tooling hasn't been available to kind of accelerate that, and Stripe is playing a part in trying to address that.
That is a shocking statistic. I'm just going to flat out say it. Because of how much at the B2C level, I engage with online payments. The fact that it's still only 5% globally blows my mind. But it's interesting what you're talking about as far as how and why you guys developed this strategy. As a salesperson, I've encountered the fact that if you are selling tools to builders, you have to have your stuff together in terms of technology, understanding how to speak to them as buyers, because it is, as you mentioned, a completely different type of conversation than what one would have with the CFO. What are some of the things that you found that developers like or dislike or more or less likely to engage with when it comes to traditional sales approaches?
Yeah, for sure. So I guess I'll caveat this with, I'm not a developer myself, but I mean, okay. I spent a lot of time working with them and selling to them and kind of understanding how they use the product. I think there's three things that really come to mind for me. The first is like the scalability of the product, right? And so what that means is I think they're looking for tools that, not only serve their needs today, but also they have quite large ambitions for where they want to go. And if the companies are successful, right, they could be scaling 10 times or 100 times bigger than they are today. And so they're really looking to kind of find the right tools that allow them to scale without having to constantly worry about, now we've outgrown this, we need to change it for a new one. They don't want to spend a lot of time reworking infrastructure. And, nobody likes paying down technical debt. It's not a fun thing to work on as a developer. A good example of that is Slack is built on Stripe, and they went from like 0 users essentially to over 1 million daily users in less than 2 years. And so they needed to build on infrastructure that could scale with them on that journey. So I think that's the first thing is making sure that they're confident that the products that they're using are scalable to help take them to the next level. Recommendations are really, really important as well. Word of mouth is really important when you're selling to developers. So I think to achieve that, you can't do that in a kind of like fake way. It's a difficult thing to fake. You have to really optimize for the product experience rather than the sales experience to achieve that. So I think when you're thinking through your sales strategy, when you're selling to developers, it's less like how do I reach more developers and create more brand recognition through marketing, but instead like how do we make the product experience so great and also the sales experience that kind of slots into that product experience, which we can talk about in a second. But like how do we make that so great that they tell all their friends and their colleagues about it and really get that kind of that positive feedback loop of recommendations going. And then the third thing, and this seems fairly obvious, but it's worth saying, is like you have to have a good product, right? The product has to be technically superior. So in our case, that means building great APIs for people who aren't familiar, application programming interfaces. They're basically a standardized format that allow different applications and services to communicate with each other. So you can integrate Stripe's API, you can use it to securely pass us credit card details, and then we'll manage everything that happens from there, like charging the card, collecting the right data and paying the money out to you. And that allows developers to build on top of it and therefore focus more of their time and their effort in building really great products and less on like the back end stuff, like being able to handle credit cards securely. And so I think because of all of that, it took Stripe a really long time to build a marketing team. Every dollar instead went on transforming the user experience across like how the product works, the engineering of it, the documentation, our customer support team. And we managed to get that kind of word of mouth flywheel going. And as a result, 80% of our business is built on word of mouth and organic growth rather than paid acquisition, which has become a real strategic differentiator, both for like how we sell into the market and the business, like the underlying fundamentals of the business.
Yeah, I think that's a really important distinction to make, especially when so much of what you do now in terms of your role has to do with startups. I mean, it is really easy to get caught up in a sales or marketing strategy that has to do with how you can make people feel or think about you and your product versus what real life impact you can have when the product is, as you termed it, superior. I know one of the things that you had that we sort of talked about offline is that, developers, they hate being sold to. I'd say that's probably the case for everyone, but in a particular way, right? It sounds like what you're describing is this need for developers or this impatience among them in their global community to sort of sit through these traditional sales processes and just like, look, tell me how you can get this thing or that thing out of my way. And then that's sort of the thing that people are spreading the word about. Would you say that's about how it goes?
Yeah, definitely. So you're 100% right. Like developers hate being sold to. I think, yeah, as you say, most people hate being sold to, but especially developers. I think you have to really think of it as like not so much as selling and more as like unblocking and partnering with them, right? So you have to make them feel confident that the solution is a good match for their needs and that, you can help them make the case internally that it makes sense for the business, both in terms of like the ROI and also to the scaling point that you're future-proofing what they're working on going forward, whether that's like expanding internationally or, being able to scale to 100 times the size of today. So, yeah, I definitely think that you have to think about the sales cycle a little bit differently and how you approach them and how you sell them is different. And I think accordingly, actually, the profile of the salesperson you need is a little bit different, right? You have to be credible when you're speaking about the product and how it works and the use cases. And so you need to find people who understand the depth of the product to be able to do that, which doesn't mean they necessarily have to be technical themselves. But I do think that they need to have kind of a deep understanding of how the product works, how technical roles work, right? What that person that they're speaking to is going to be actually doing with the product, and then be able to relate that back to how our product works in order to build credibility. So I think, yeah, the sales process is different, and also even the person who's running the sales process has to be a little bit different.
Yeah, I mean, or at least even if you can't start with like this level of expertise with which you can speak about these things to developers, there's got to be that level of respect there. I cannot tell you how many times I've been on a sales floor and, this individual, the salesperson, was reached a CFO and thought that was going to be their way into the organization and making something happen. And then they're like, and they're making me talk to the developer now. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so there's this fear or frustration about having to actually have a respect and understanding of what the real world impact is going to be of this solution within an organization, and developers want you to have that knowledge, it's a whole other conversation that I was actually just having last week about whether or not salespeople need to be product experts. But I would say when selling to developers, it's an easy yes. So thanks for sort of illuminating that for us.
Yeah, and I think that's a great point as well, right? It's almost like a mindset, right? The developer is really important in the decision making process, and it's not somebody you just have to convince on the side that they should go along with it, right? You have to kind of reorientate the whole sales process around them to make sure that everyone on the team understands that they're kind of like the most important piece of the buying process, right?
Yeah, it contributes to the emergence of this sales engineer role. If you're lucky at an organization to have one of those on your team, right, to be able to speak to those things specifically, versus where I've seen entire training sessions on how to get around the developer, and just talk to somebody who you can, be more, I guess, emotionally manipulate. And I don't mean to paint sales. I am a salesperson, right? So I don't mean to paint it in a negative light. But I'm just saying that there is the need for this shift to knowing what you're talking about and being transparent about it, that I think is going to elevate the entire profession. But I digress. So one of the other things that we talked about was this idea that viral recommendations are obviously amazingly helpful, but can you really optimize a sales strategy for that? Talk a little bit about your thoughts on this idea.
Yeah. So I think how your product works, if you have a technical product and you're selling to developers, has to be the most important thing. And the sales strategy really has to fit in alongside that to supplement it and to reinforce some of the positive things, right? I think the most important thing to get right is to really just get developers using the product as quickly as possible. So back in the day when we were just getting started, John and Patrick, the founders, Stripe went through Y Combinator, which is an accelerator program in San Francisco. And they were working with a bunch of the other companies that were in their cohort. And when a company was like, right, I need to monetize my product, they kind of jump in there, get them on Stripe straight away, show them how to use it, even often integrate it for them, and just to get them using it quickly. And so I think that kind of attitude, whilst John and Patrick, the founders, are not doing the integrations for for individual customers anymore, that kind of approach of getting the customers using the product really quickly has kind of played through into how our products work. So it means you can sign up for an account just with an email address, you get your set of API keys, you can start playing around straight away. We've got a really great kind of test mode that lets you do everything that you could do with the live product in a test environment, so that you can kind of make mistakes and learn by doing, which is important. And then everything works exactly the same. So all your reporting, your dashboards, etc., in the test mode look exactly like they would in the live mode, except you're not charging anyone real money on real credit cards. And so that allows people to start using the product really quickly, get comfortable with it, get really confident that is the right product for their needs. And similarly, so that's from a product point of view, I think that on the sales side, the thing that goes with that, right, is one, you don't necessarily need to sell to them before that, but you might want to check in with them once they've used the product a little bit. Similarly, you want to give them access to the product before they have to commit to signing any contracts, to talking about what the pricing is, etc. And so making it really easy to get going without necessarily having to interact with the salesperson is quite a big part of the sales strategy. And then when the salesperson can add value, which is after the developers played around with the product, they have a basic understanding of how it works and that it might be a good fit, then involving the salesperson to kind of answer any questions the customer has and really move the conversation on to the next level is the right way about it.
Yeah.
So I think, yeah, you have to think about the product experience and the sales experience as kind of one journey, rather than there's sales and then you get to use the product.
Yeah, and I think there's another whole can of worms, right? This big debate on, because I've seen these really heated conversations at organizations where salespeople are thinking that if you allow that kind of access that you're talking about to see how things work before, they've paid for anything or made any kind of commitment, they're like, hey, we're giving it away and you're cutting my legs off. But I think it matters who's asking for that. And one of the ways I knew I was talking to a developer in these sales roles was if they asked about APIs. Because a lot of the time, your CFO wasn't going to ask that question. He's going to be asking for you to make the ROI case. But if you're talking to a developer, they're going to ask about the API. And I think in that case, it's definitely worth it, not to mention the fact that it's going to be necessary, I think, moving forward to scale. But it's definitely worth it to give them that access, because if they're asking that question, it's a good thing. It's because they're paying attention and they're actually interested. It's different from, again, if a CFO asks me about an API, he might just be trying to blow me off and it might be something different. But talk a little bit about that, about what makes a good API and how part of what you guys do over there at Stripe is, that's so critical to it, right? Making enough programs speak to each other that it's not a barrier for people to come on board.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think, you hit on a good point there, right? When the CFO is asking about an API, it's most likely kind of a checkbox exercise of like, does this have this sort of functionality, right? And so a lot of people have APIs, right? You can go into the market and tick that box for most providers, but it really comes down to like how the API works. The details of it are really important. And that's what the developers really care about, right? Whether you have an API or not, if you don't have one, then the developer's probably going to be less excited about working on it. But even then, it's important, the next level of detail. So to give some examples of kind of what we do and what we think makes our API really great, it's, not just the fact that we have one, but it's really well documented. So the documentation's really clear. We update it based on, if the user's logged in, then everything will customize to their account. It will say the currency that their account is set up in. It will say the country that they're based in, etc. And it will generate kind of live snippets of code that you can use and test with. So it's much more dynamic than your standard, like, here's the API reference guide. It's a 300-page printed book. So that's one thing. And then when you're using it, things like you submit a request to the API, and if you do something wrong, it won't just be an error code like error 50, try again. It will actually explain like, oh, it looks like you're trying to save this card. In order to do that, you'll have to do this. And so it's a lot more interactive and helpful than like a standard API, which just you're like, oh, there's an error here, it's not going to work. And then finally, the stuff I mentioned on the test mode is really important, right? Being able to play around safely and know that you're not going to break anything is key. And similarly, we provide a lot of that functionality even when people are live, right? They can choose when they roll to a new version of the API so that they're not breaking their integration because we've released some updates to the API. So I think all of those things come together. And I think the important thing is not having the API, but really the details that sit underneath that. That's the product experience rather than the product itself.
For sure. So you guys have this framework that's not just, teaching one platform to talk to another through API, but what I'm getting is you teaching salespeople how to speak to developers when it comes to helping developers get done what they need to get done in terms of a solution, and elevating our game when it comes to how we find entry points into organizations with our solution. So this has all been really good stuff. And one of the things that we do at Sweetfish that we're all about is providing this, resource that is, free for people to come and sort of find information about the sorts of things that we're talking about to elevate B2B organizations. What are some of the learning resources that are, that you guys are into these days over there at Stripe? What are y'all reading? What are you listening to?
Yeah, so a bit cheeky, but I think we have some great guides actually on our website, and they're not just about payments, they're about starting a company and scaling it, and a lot about how to sell to developers. So definitely encourage people to check that out. That's at stripe.com/guides. I think there's a lot of great resources as well. If you're looking at kind of what developers care about, I think you have to kind of go to the communities that they're in. So maybe that's like Hacker News or, some other places like that developers hang out. I think there's some that's a great way to learn about kind of what developers care about.
Got it. So go where the developers are.
Exactly. Yeah.
Really
go understand your customers and don't be afraid to engage with them, right? I think that's the number one thing, like you mentioned, right? A lot of salespeople are a bit scared to kind of sell to developers, but they shouldn't be, right? If they know their product well, that's what matters. They don't need to know how to code to be able to have a really great conversation.
Yes. I love it so much. James, this has been a really, really informative conversation for me. I can't wait to hear feedback from our listeners on it. One last note, how can folks connect with you?
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, James Allgrove, and I am on Twitter. I'm not super active, but I'm trying to get better at that. And I'm also at James Allgrove on that.
Thanks so much. Well, I'll hopefully have you again, and I'm excited to watch what you guys are doing over there at Stripe. Thanks so much, James.
Thanks, Nikki. This has been fun. Cheers.
We totally get it. We publish a ton of content on this podcast, and it can be a lot to keep up with. That's why we've started the B2B Growth Big 3, a no-fluff email that boils down our 3 biggest takeaways from an entire week of episodes. Sign up today at sweetfishmedia.com/big3. That's sweetfishmedia.com/big3.